you were to stand on the edge of the Capitoline Hill in the year 390 BC, just as the sun began its slow, honeyed descent behind the Janiculum, you would not see the Rome of white marble and imperial glory that echoes through the history books. That city, the city of Caesars and colossal amphitheaters, was a dream still waiting in the distant future. The Rome of this story, our Rome, was a city of terracotta and tuff, of sun-baked brick and timber, a sprawling, breathing creature that smelled of wood smoke, roasting garlic, and the damp, earthy scent of the Tiber River. It was a city that knew how to rest. As the light softened, turning from the harsh white of the midday Mediterranean sun to a warm, enveloping amber, the noises of the great market and the forum below began to thin. The shouting of fishmongers, the clatter of wooden cartwheels against stone, and the sharp ringing of the blacksmith's hammer all gradually surrendered to the evening breeze. The dust that had been kicked up by thousands of sandaled feet settled slowly back onto the paving stones, drifting like a lazy fog. High above this bustle, separated from the common noise by steep cliffs and sacred walls, lived a man named Aulus. Aulus was not a senator wrapped in a purple-bordered toga, debating the fate of nations with thunderous rhetoric. He was not a centurion with scars etched into his skin like a map of the Republic's conquests, nor was he a wealthy merchant with ships sailing from Ostia. Aulus was, by all accounts, a man of little consequence to the grand machinery of history. He was a man of middling height, possessing a head of hair that had long ago turned the colour of iron filings, and a left knee that clicked like a dry twig whenever rain was approaching. Aulus was the Ansararius, the keeper of the Sacred Geese. His domain was the Temple of Juno Moneta, a sanctuary perched on the Arx, the northern summit of the Capitoline Hill. It was a position of immense spiritual importance, though Aulus mostly viewed it as a job of immense cleaning. The temple was a quiet place, surrounded by high walls that blocked the wind and held the warmth of the sun well into the evening. It was here, in the shadow of the goddess, that Aulus found his peace. On this particular evening, the air was heavy and still. Aulus swept the courtyard with a broom made of birch twigs, the rhythmic swish, swish, swish sound acting as a lullaby for the approaching night. He moved with the slow, deliberate efficiency of a man who has performed the same task for 40 years. He knew every crack in the stone floor, every stubborn patch of moss that grew on the north side of the portico, and exactly how the light hit the statue of Juno at this specific hour, making her bronze eyes seem to soften with wisdom. "Easy now, heavy feet," he murmured to himself, pausing to rub his aching knee. "The rain is coming from the north, sure as the river flows." He leaned on his broom and looked out over the parapet. From this height, the people down in the forum looked like ants scurrying back to their hills. Smoke was beginning to rise from 1,000 hearths, curling up into the darkening sky to join the first few stars. It was a comforting sight, the visual rhythm of a city preparing for sleep. There was a safety in it, a sense that the routine of life would continue unbroken, day after day, year after year. But Aulus's attention was quickly drawn away from the view by a loud, indignant honk from the enclosure behind him. "I hear you! I hear you!" Aulus said, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Patience is a virtue, Clementia, even for a bird." He turned to face his charges. The sacred geese of Juno were not ordinary barnyard fowl. They were magnificent, imposing creatures with feathers as white as fresh milk and eyes that burned with a surprising intelligence. They were dedicated to the goddess, protected by ancient law, and, quite frankly, they knew it. They carried themselves with the haughty arrogance of aristocrats, waddling through the temple grounds as if they owned the very stones upon which Rome was built. There were 12 of them in the flock this season. Aulus knew them all by name and temperament. There was Magnus, the gander who led the flock and hissed at anyone wearing the colour red. Flavia, who had a peculiar fondness for eating bugs off the temple columns. And Clementia, who was currently stretching her long, graceful neck over the fence, demanding her dinner with soft, insistent chortles. Aulus abandoned his broom and walked over to the grain sacks stored in the cool shade of the temple porch. He plunged his hands into the sack, the dry, cool barley slipping through his fingers like river stones. It was a tactile sensation he loved, the feeling of the grain, the smell of the dust, the simple, honest weight of it. "Here we are," he whispered, stepping into the enclosure. The geese surrounded him instantly, a sea of white down and orange beaks. Yet, for all their size and occasional noise, they were gentle with him. They knew his smell, the texture of his tunic, and the slow cadence of his walk. To the rest of Rome, these birds were holy symbols, untouchable and distant. To Aulus, they were simply his family. He scattered the grain in a wide arc. The birds dipped their heads in unison, the sound of their beaks tapping against the ground, creating a rapid, gentle percussion, like rain falling on a roof. Aulus sat on a small wooden stool he kept in the corner of the pen, watching them eat. This was his favorite part of the day. The sun was gone now, leaving behind a bruised purple sky. The torches in the temple sanctuary were being lit by the younger priests, casting long, dancing shadows across the courtyard. It was a peaceful existence. But Aulus was not ignorant of the world beyond his walls. He knew the rumors that were drifting down the Via Flaminia. Merchants coming up to the temple to offer sacrifices had been whispering for weeks. They spoke of a new enemy from the far north, beyond the mountains. They called them Gauls, men said to be giants, with hair like straw and voices like thunder, who fought without armor and feared nothing. Aulus watched Magnus the gander chase a moth, snapping his beak with a comical clack. It was hard to imagine giants and wars in this serene twilight. Rome had enemies, certainly, the Etruscans, the Volci, the Aequi, but Rome always won. The city was eternal. The walls were high, and the gods, presumably, were watching. "Don't worry, Magnus," Aulus said softly, reaching out to stroke the bird's smooth, warm neck as the gander waddled back. "No giants are getting up here. The hill is too steep, and you are too loud. You'd scare them off before they cross the river." Magnus let out a low, sleepy trill and settled down in the straw next to Aulus's feet, tucking his head under a massive wing. The air grew cooler. The sounds of the city below had changed. The work noises were gone, replaced by the murmur of families eating dinner, the distant bark of a dog, and the soft chirping of crickets in the temple gardens. It was a heavy, lidded atmosphere, the kind that makes your shoulders drop an inch and your breathing slow down. Aulus stayed there for a long time, just sitting in the dark with the birds. He felt a deep kinship with them. They were the watchers, the sentinels of the goddess, but they were also creatures of comfort. They loved their routine. They loved the safety of the coop. As the moon began to rise, a sliver of silver hanging over the Palatine Hill, Aulus stood up, his knees cracking again. "Bedtime, little ones," he whispered. He ushered the stragglers into the inner shelter of the coop, latching the wooden gate with a satisfying thud. He checked the lock twice, a habit born of anxiety, not for thieves, but for foxes. Satisfied, he picked up his broom and walked back toward his small quarters attached to the rear of the temple. He paused at the entrance to his room and looked back at the enclosure. The geese were silent now, huddled together in a great white mass of warmth. The temple was silent. The city was sinking into slumber. Aulus didn't know it yet, but this was the last truly peaceful night the city would see for a long time. The wind shifting the leaves in the sacred grove was blowing from the north, and it carried more than just rain. It carried the scent of iron and ash. But for tonight, the danger was just a story, a whisper in the dark, unable to penetrate the thick walls of the sanctuary. Aulus extinguished his small oil lamp, the flames sputtering out and leaving a trail of grey smoke. He lay down on his straw mattress, pulling a heavy wool blanket up to his chin. He closed his eyes, listening to the silence, listening to the breathing of the city, and drifted into a dreamless sleep, safe in the heart of Rome. Time in the ancient world did not move by the ticking of a mechanical clock, nor by the frantic urgency of a digital notification. It moved by the length of shadows, the color of the leaves, and the slow, inevitable rotation of the stars. In the days following Aulus's peaceful evening with his flock, time seemed to stretch and slow down, wrapping the Capitoline Hill in a haze of early autumn mist. The mornings began to carry a chill, a crisp, biting freshness that nipped at the nose and fingers. When Aulus pushed open the heavy wooden door of his quarters before dawn, the world outside was often swallowed by white fog. The Tiber River, winding its way through the valley below, breathed out this damp veil, hiding the temples and the tenements of the lower city until the sun was strong enough to burn it away. For Aulus, these misty mornings were a private sanctuary. The rest of the city was hidden, a grey ocean of silence. He was alone on his island in the sky, accompanied only by the soft, rhythmic dripping of condensation falling from the eaves of the Temple of Juno. "Up and about, are we?" Aulus would whisper, his breath pluming in the cold air as he unlatched the geese enclosure. The birds were often sluggish in the chill. They would emerge from their coop one by one, shaking their feathers with a sound like flapping canvas, looking at Aulus with mild accusation, as if he were personally responsible for the drop in temperature. Magnus, the great gander, would march out last, his chest puffed out, inspecting the yard for any overnight intruders, usually just a wayward snail or a fallen leaf that had the audacity to land in his territory. Aulus's routine was unshakable. It was the anchor of his life, and in many ways, the anchor of the temple itself. He scrubbed the stone water trough with a stiff brush until the limestone shone pale and clean. He refilled it with water drawn from the deep cistern, the bucket coming up heavy and cold. The sound of the water splashing into the trough was clear and musical, a sharp melody in the muffled quiet of the fog. But as the days turned into weeks, the silence of the city below began to change quality. It was no longer the silence of rest. It was the silence of holding one's breath. The first signs were not armies or alarms, but the behavior of the people who came to the hill. Usually, the Temple of Juno Moneta was a place of steady, casual traffic. Matrons came to pray for safe childbirth. Merchants came to offer thanks for a profitable venture. Young couples came to shyly ask for blessings. They would chat with Aulus, comment on the fatness of the geese, or complain about the price of olives. Now, the visitors were different. They moved faster. They spoke in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders. They offered sacrifices not for profit, but for protection. One afternoon, a grain merchant named Callias arrived with a monthly supply of barley for the sacred flock. Callias was usually a jovial man, round-faced and prone to telling long, exaggerated jokes about his mother-in-law. Today, however, he drove his mule cart up the steep incline of the Clivus Capitolinus with a grim determination. Aulus met him at the service gate. The sun was out, but the light seemed thin, filtered through high milky clouds that had drifted down from the Alps. "Hail, Aulus," Callias said, hoisting a sack of grain onto his shoulder. He didn't smile. "Hail, Callias. The mule looks tired," Aulus observed, taking a corner of the sack to help guide it into the storage shed. "We're all tired," Callias grunted, dropping the sack with a heavy thud. He wiped sweat from his brow, though it wasn't particularly warm. "The roads to the north are clogged. It took me 3 hours just to get through the Flaminian Gate. Carts coming in, carts going out. Everyone is shouting, nobody is listening." Aulus untied the sack, running a handful of barley through his fingers to check for weevils. The grain was good, golden and dry. "Moving out. Where are they going?" "South," Callias said, leaning against the doorframe and looking toward the horizon. "Away from the river, away from the stories." "Stories?" Aulus asked gently. He walked over to the water jar and poured a cup for the merchant. Callias took the cup and drank deeply. "The Gauls. They say they are at Clusium now. That's Etruscan land, I know, but it's not far enough. People say they drink wine undiluted and fight naked in the snow." He shook his head. "I don't know what to believe, Aulus, but the senators are walking around with faces like thunder." Aulus looked at his geese. Flavia was currently trying to untie the leather strap of Callias's sandal, tugging at it with gentle persistence. "The Senate always looks like thunder, Callias. It makes them feel important." Callias managed a weak smile. "Maybe, but I'm sending my wife and little ones to her sister in Neapolis tomorrow, just to be safe." When the merchant left, the sound of his cartwheels rattling away seemed incredibly lonely. Aulus stood at the gate for a long time. He looked north. The hills were a patchwork of green and brown, peaceful and silent. It was hard to reconcile the panic in Callias's voice with the serene landscape before him. The world looked exactly as it always had, ancient, solid, enduring. Yet, the atmosphere on the Capitoline was tightening. The priests of Juno, usually serene men who glided through the corridors in white linen, were now frequently seen huddled in corners, whispering. The Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome, was seen hurrying to and from the Curia in the forum below, his robes gathered up to move faster. Even the weather seemed to conspire with the mood. The wind shifted permanently to the north, blowing steady and cool. It rattled the dried leaves in the oak trees and made the torches in the temple flicker and dance wildly, casting erratic shadows that jumped along the walls like nervous spirits. One evening, Aulus sat with the geese as the twilight deepened into a bruised purple. He was mending a tear in his tunic, the needle weaving in and out of the coarse wool. The rhythm was soothing. In, out, in, out. Magnus the gander came and sat beside him. The bird was unusually quiet. Animals, Aulus knew, had a sense for things that humans had lost. They could feel the vibrations in the earth, the shift in air pressure. Magnus rested his head on Aulus's knee, his dark eyes watching the flickering light of the oil lamp. "You feel it too, don't you, old friend?" Aulus murmured. He scratched the bird behind the jaw, right where the feathers were softest. Magnus let out a low, vibrating purr. Down in the forum, the usual evening noise was absent. There was no music, no laughter spilling out of the taverns. Instead, there was the rhythmic, metallic sound of the blacksmiths working late. Clang, clang, clang. They were sharpening swords. They were beating out dents in bronze breastplates. The sound drifted up the cliff face, a heartbeat of preparation that echoed off the stone temples. Aulus put down his sewing. He walked to the parapet and looked down. Torches were moving in the streets below, weaving patterns in the dark. Groups of men were gathering. The city, usually a sprawling mess of individual lives, was beginning to contract, to harden. It was like watching a snail retreat into its shell at the touch of a finger. He looked back at the temple. The marble columns glowed faintly in the moonlight, stark and beautiful. This place, this citadel, was the highest point in the city. It was the crown of Rome. If the waters rose, this was the rock that would remain dry. If the fire came, this was the stone that would not burn. A sense of protective responsibility welled up in Aulus's chest. It was a quiet feeling, not a roar of heroism, but a steady, warm resolve. He was just an old man with a bad knee and a broom, but this was his post. These were his birds. This was his goddess. "Let them come," he whispered to the wind. "We have nowhere else to go." He went back to the coop and did something he hadn't done in years. He double-checked the structural integrity of the fence. He tested the hinges. He piled extra straw in the corner to keep the birds warm against the increasing chill. He moved with a slow, deliberate care, ensuring that every latch was secure, every gap plugged. The geese watched him, their heads tilting, their black eyes reflecting the moon. They sensed his focus. They clustered around him, not begging for food this time, but simply offering their presence. There was a comfort in the warmth of their bodies, a reminder of the simple, biological imperative of life. Survive, stay warm, stay together. As Aulus finally retired to his room that night, the wind howled around the corners of the temple, a mournful sound that seemed to carry the voices of thousands. He lay in the dark, listening to the city below, holding its breath, waiting for the storm that was no longer a rumor, but a reality marching down the Via Salaria. The world was changing. The golden age of peace was ending. But in the dark, Aulus's breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of the sleeping flock outside. He closed his eyes, visualizing the white feathers, the stone walls, the high cliff. He was safe here. For now, he was safe. And sleep, heavy and merciful, pulled him under. The news of the defeat at the river Allia did not arrive in Rome with the fanfare of trumpets or the clattering hooves of a royal courier. It arrived like a creeping fog, heavy and undeniable. Aulus was the first to notice the change in the texture of the air. He was up on the temple roof, clearing wind-blown leaves from the gutter, when he saw the dust rising on the northern horizon. It was a thick, chalky cloud that blotted out the blue of the sky, moving slowly toward the city gates. Usually, a dust cloud meant a herd of cattle, or perhaps a returning legion victorious in battle, marching in rhythmic step. But this cloud was different. It was chaotic. It moved in fits and starts. As the source of the dust drew closer, Aulus could see that it was not a formation of soldiers, but a ragged, stumbling stream of humanity. The survivors of the army were returning, but they brought no glory with them, only the heavy, suffocating weight of silence. They entered the gates without a word, their heads bowed, their shields hanging low or missing entirely. From his high vantage point on the Capitoline, Aulus watched the realization spread through the city below like ink in water. There was no screaming, at least not at first. The magnitude of the disaster was too large for noise. The Roman army, the shield of the city, had been broken. The road to Rome was open. Aulus climbed down from the roof, his knees protesting the descent, and went to check on the geese. They were pacing nervously, their webbed feet slapping against the stone pavement. Even the usually imperious Magnus was subdued, huddled near the water trough. Aulus sat with them for a moment, letting the normalcy of their presence ground him. He filled a small wooden bowl with water and offered it to Clementia, who drank with delicate, shivering sips. "It's all right," he soothed, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "The walls are thick. The rock is strong." But down below, the city was beginning to move. It was the movement of a great tide receding. The magistrates and the priests, the fathers and the mothers, had made the impossible decision. Rome, the sprawling brick and timber Rome of the valleys, could not be defended. The walls were too long, the defenders too few. And so the order was given: take what you can carry and leave. From the edge of the citadel, Aulus witnessed a sight that would haunt the memory of the city for generations. Yet he viewed it with a strange, detached calm. It was a procession of sorrow. The Flaminian Way became a river of people flowing away from their homes. Carts piled high with furniture, bedding, and amphorae of oil creaked and groaned under the weight. Aulus watched a man carrying a grandfather's clock on his back, the pendulum swinging wildly with every step. He saw a woman leading a goat with a garland of flowers around its neck, whispering to it as if it were a child. There was a surreal slowness to it all. Time seemed to drag its heels. Aulus watched the Vestal Virgins, the guardians of Rome's eternal fire, leave their round temple in the Forum. They walked in a single file, their white veils fluttering in the breeze, carrying the sacred vessels and the fire that must never go out. They did not run. They moved with a solemn grace, walking barefoot toward the bridge that would take them to safety in the Etruscan city of Caere. Aulus felt a lump in his throat, seeing that white line of purity leaving the heart of the city. It felt as if the soul of Rome was packing its bags. Yet, not everyone left. The citadel and the Capitol, the twin summits of the hill where Aulus lived, were to be the last stand. The strongest men, the remaining soldiers, and the most valuable treasures were brought up the steep, winding path of the Clivus Capitolinus. Aulus stood by the gate of the sanctuary, watching the reinforcements arrive. They looked tired, these young men, their faces smeared with grime, but there was a steeliness in their eyes now. They were cornered, and that made them dangerous. They began to barricade the gates, piling stones and timber, sealing the fortress off from the city below. As the sun began to dip lower, painting the sky in shades of bruised violet and burnt orange, The flow of people leaving the city trickled to a stop. The gates of Rome were left open. There was no one left to close them. The streets, usually teeming with life, noise, and the smell of cooking, were now empty canyons of shadow. It was then that Aulus noticed the strangest thing of all. Down in the courtyards of the grand houses, in the open-air atriums of the wealthy, figures remained. Aulus squinted, shielding his eyes against the dying light. They were the elders, the old senators, the men who had led Rome in the days of its rising power, had refused to flee. They had refused to burden the younger generation or crowd the citadel. They sat in their ivory curule chairs, dressed in their finest ceremonial robes of purple and white. They sat in their doorways and courtyards, motionless as statues, waiting. They looked like gods carved from marble, sitting in judgment of the coming storm. Aulus couldn't see their faces clearly from this distance, but he could feel their dignity. It was a silent act of defiance that radiated a profound, melancholy beauty. They were becoming part of the architecture, merging with the history of the city they loved too much to leave. The sun finally slipped below the horizon, and the great silence descended. It was a silence so deep, so absolute, that it felt heavy on the eardrums. For the first time in centuries, there was no hum of the city, no distant murmur of thousands of conversations, no rumble of wheels, no barking of dogs. Even the stray dogs had followed the people. The only sound was the wind whistling through the columns of the Temple of Juno and the rustle of the oak trees. Aulus turned away from the parapet. The world below had ended, or at least paused. But up here, life had to continue. The geese needed to be fed. He went to the storage shed, his sandals scuffing softly on the grit. The sound seemed incredibly loud in the quiet. He scooped up the grain, the barley kernels flowing like water, a familiar and comforting sound. "Supper time," he whispered, and the sound of his own voice startled him. The geese gathered around him, their white feathers glowing softly in the twilight. They seemed to sense that the world had shrunk. They stayed close to his legs, not wandering to the edges of the pen as they usually did. Magnus didn't even hiss at the new soldiers patrolling the nearby wall. He just ate his grain with a serious, methodical intensity. Aulus sat on his stool, wrapping his wool cloak tighter around his shoulders. The air was getting cold. He looked up at the stars, which were beginning to prick through the darkening blue vault of the heavens. They looked the same as they had yesterday. The constellation of the hunter still chased the bull. The seven sisters still clustered together for warmth. The heavens were indifferent to the emptying of cities. A young soldier, hardly more than a boy, walked past the enclosure. He was clutching a spear that looked too heavy for him. He paused, looking at the old man and the birds. "It's quiet, grandfather," the soldier said, his voice trembling slightly. Aulus looked up. "It is," he agreed softly, "but the wind is still blowing, and the stars are still shining. Rest while you can, lad. Silence is a gift, even when it comes in strange wrapping." The boy nodded, seeming comforted by the mundane sight of a man feeding birds, and continued his patrol. Aulus finished his task and locked the coop. He checked the latch 3 times. Click, click, click. The sound was a reassuring punctuation mark in the quiet night. He walked to the edge of the cliff one last time before bed. The city below was a black void, swallowing the moonlight. There were no lamps lit in the windows. It was a ghost city, waiting for its new masters. But up here, On the rock, a single torch burned near the temple entrance, a small defiant star in the darkness. Aulus went into his room and lay down. He felt a profound exhaustion, deep in his bones, the kind of tiredness that comes from watching history happen. He pulled his blanket up, listening to the silence. It wasn't scary anymore. It was just a blank page, waiting for what would come next. He focused on the rhythm of his own breathing, slow and steady, in and out, until the silence of the city merged with the silence of his mind, and he drifted into a heavy, dreamless slumber. The sun rose the next morning, not upon Rome, but upon an island of stone floating in a sea of mist. The clouds had descended from the Apennines during the night, heavy and wet, filling the valleys and the winding streets of the lower city until only the peaks of the hills remained visible. To Aulus, standing on the ramparts of the citadel with his morning cup of watered wine, it felt as though the world he knew had simply washed away, leaving the Capitoline Hill drifting alone in a white, silent ocean. This isolation brought with it a strange, suspended sense of time. Up here, above the clouds, the sky was a piercing, brilliant blue. The air was thin and cold, carrying the scent of pine resin and wet stone. The panic of the evacuation had faded into a dull, rhythmic waiting. There were no chariots to dodge, no markets to navigate, no schedules to keep other than the rising and setting of the sun. Aulus turned from the view and began his morning rounds. The temple complex had become a small village in itself. Soldiers slept wrapped in their cloaks under the porticos. Piles of javelins were stacked neatly against the columns where merchants used to stand. Yet, the presence of the Sacred Geese commanded a respectful radius of empty space. Even the most hardened centurion knew better than to disturb the birds of Juno. "Morning, Your Majesty," Aulus whispered, unlatching the gate to the enclosure. Magnus the gander stepped out with a regal stretch of his wings, the white feathers catching the morning light and glowing like spun silver. The bird looked at the soldiers sleeping nearby, let out a low, disapproving honk, and then turned his attention to the bucket of water Aulus was pouring. The sound of the water splashing into the limestone trough was the loudest thing on the hill. Splosh, splash, trickle. It was a sound of life, of continuity. Aulus scrubbed the edge of the trough with a handful of straw. He moved slowly, his joints stiff from the damp air. There was no rush today. There was nowhere to go. Around mid-morning, the mist below began to thin, burned away by the climbing sun. As the veil lifted, the reality of their situation revealed itself. The city below was teeming. The Gauls had arrived. From the dizzying height of the citadel, the invaders did not look like the giants of rumour. They looked like a shifting pattern of earth tones, browns, ochres, and dull reds, flowing through the streets like a muddy river. They moved slowly, cautiously, awed perhaps by the scale of the city they had captured. There was no shouting that reached the heights of the capital. The distance turned everything into a pantomime. Aulus stood beside a young soldier named Lucius, both of them leaning on the stone parapet. Lucius was gripping his spear so tightly his knuckles were white. "There are so many of them," Lucius whispered, his voice tight. "Like ants at a picnic," Aulus observed calmly, squinting against the glare. "But ants cannot climb smooth glass, and they cannot fly. They are down there, and we are up here." They watched as the tiny figures below moved into the forum. They saw them stop at the open courtyards where the old senators sat. From this distance, it was impossible to see the details, to see the faces or the swords. There was just a pause in the movement of the crowd, a stillness that lasted for a long heartbeat, and then the river of brown surged forward again. Aulus turned away. He did not need to see more. He knew that the roam of the valley was gone. What mattered now was the roam of the hill. As the afternoon wore on, a new sensory detail was added to the siege, the smell of smoke. It started as a faint tang, like a neighbor burning autumn leaves, but soon it grew richer and heavier. The invaders had begun to set fires. It was not a raging inferno that consumed the city all at once, but a series of slow, smouldering fires. Smoke drifted up the cliff face in lazy grey ribbons. It wrapped around the columns of the Temple of Juno, softening the harsh sunlight. Aulus worried for the birds. Geese had sensitive lungs. He spent the afternoon dampening heavy woolen cloths in the cistern and hanging them around the windward side of the coop to filter the air. "Breathe easy, little ones," he murmured, adjusting a wet blanket. "It's just a bit of fog, just a bit of cloud." The geese seemed unbothered. They tucked their beaks into their breast feathers and napped, one leg drawn up into their downy warmth. Their calmness was contagious. Aulus sat on his stool, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of their backs. In, out, in, out. The world might be burning below, but here, in the shadow of the goddess, there was only the soft rustle of feathers and the drip of water. Later in the day, a tall man with broad shoulders and a face that looked as though it had been chiseled from granite walked into the courtyard. It was Marcus Manlius, the commander of the garrison. He wore a bronze breastplate that had been polished until it mirrored the sky, and he moved with the easy, predatory grace of a panther. He stopped by the enclosure, watching Aulus work. "The birds are well?" Manlius asked. His voice was deep, a baritone that seemed to resonate in the stone floor. Aulus stood up and bowed his head slightly. "They are calm, Commander. They eat well. They sleep well." Manlius nodded, looking out over the wall at the smoke rising from the city. "They are better off than most, then. We have food for now, Aulus, but the siege will be long. The Gauls are not leaving. They are making themselves comfortable in our houses." "Then we must be comfortable in ours," Aulus replied simply. "Patience is the only weapon we need today." Manlius looked at the old man, a flicker of amusement in his tired eyes. "Patience. Yes, I have swords and spears, but you offer me patience. I will take it." He reached out and rested a hand on the wooden fence of the coop. "Keep them safe, keeper. They are the eyes of the goddess. If they sleep, we must not." "They are excellent watchers," Aulus assured him. "Nothing moves in this courtyard without Magnus having something to say about it." As evening fell, the fires below transformed the night. The darkness was not black, but a glowing, throbbing orange. The underbellies of the clouds reflected the light, casting a surreal amber twilight over the citadel. It was beautiful in a melancholy way, like the embers of a dying hearth. The heat from the fires rose up the cliffs, keeping the autumn chill at bay. It was comfortably warm on the ramparts. The soldiers, exhausted by the tension of the day, sat in small groups, eating their rations of hard bread and dried figs. They spoke in low tones, telling stories not of war, but of home, of a girl in Veii, of a dog that could catch apples, of the best way to prune a vine. Aulus sat with his back against the warm stone of the temple wall. He had a piece of bread in his hand, which he crumbled slowly. he tossed a few crumbs to a sparrow that had brave enough to land near his sandal. The isolation was complete now. The stairs leading down to the city had been destroyed or blocked. They were a ship at sea, with no port to call at. But strangely, Aulus felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The worst had happened. The city was taken. And yet, he was still here. The sky was still above him. The birds were still breathing. He listened to the wind shifting, carrying the smoke away to the south. The air cleared slightly. Above the orange glow of the city, the stars began to appear, faint and distant. Aulus closed his eyes. He imagined the Capitoline Hill as a great, slumbering beast curled up for the night. The temple was its heart, beating slowly. Thump, 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 thump. He could hear the soft snoring of a soldier nearby. He could hear the rustle of the straw in the goose pen. The sounds wove together into a blanket of sound, heavy and comforting. "Sleep now," he whispered to the city, to the soldiers, to the birds. "The rock is strong. The night is long. We are here." He stood up slowly, his knees clicking, and made his way to his small room. He didn't light a lamp. The glow from the fires below provided enough light to see by. He lay down on his bed, the wool rough against his cheek. He watched the shadows dance on the ceiling, slow, hypnotic movements like fish swimming in a deep pond. His eyelids grew heavy. The tension of the day dissolved into the mattress. He was the keeper. He had kept them safe for another day, and tomorrow he would do it again. With that simple, solid thought anchoring him, Aulus let go of the waking world and drifted into the deep, restorative silence of sleep. The days on the citadel began to blur, one melting into the next, like wax dripping from a candle. Without the frantic rhythm of the market or the structured hours of the Senate, time on the hill became circular, measured only by the movement of the sun across the temple floor. For Aulus, the siege existed only as a distant, smoky haze. His reality was here, within the high, windowless walls of the sanctuary of Juno Moneta. To enter the temple grounds was to step out of the world of men and into a space of suspended breath. The noise of the garrison, the sharpening of swords, the low murmurs of soldiers faded away at the heavy bronze doors. Inside, the air was always cool, holding a stillness that felt ancient, as if the breath of the goddess herself were preserved between the columns. This morning, the light entered the sanctuary through the high, clear-story openings, cutting through the shadows in thick, solid beams. Dust motes danced in these shafts of light, swirling in slow, hypnotic patterns that Aulus could watch for hours. They looked like tiny stars, rising and falling in an unseen current. Aulus moved through this space with a reverence that had become second nature. He carried a bucket of water mixed with lemon oil and a soft woolen rag. It was time to clean the floor of the inner sanctum. He knelt on the stone, the cold seeping gently into his knees. A familiar ache that told him rain was unlikely today. He dipped the rag into the water, wrung it out until it was just damp, and began to wipe the marble. Swirl, lift, dip, swirl, lift, dip. The motion was repetitive, meditative. The scent of the lemon oil rose up, sharp and clean, cutting through the musty smell of old incense and beeswax. Above him loomed the great statue of Juno. In the dim light, she was a towering figure of bronze and ivory, her robes cascading in frozen folds, her face impassive and serene. She was Juno Moneta, Juno the warner, the advisor. She was the protector of the city's memory. Aulus often spoke to her as he worked, his voice a low whisper that didn't disturb the silence. "Just a bit of dust today, lady," he murmured, polishing the base of the plinth. "The world outside is messy, but your house remains clean." He worked his way backward toward the entrance, leaving a trail of gleaming, damp stone that reflected the ceiling beams like a dark mirror. It was satisfying work. There was a beginning, a middle, and an end. When he was finished, the temple smelled of citrus and care. Outside in the courtyard, the true masters of the hill were beginning their midday routine. The sacred flock of geese was, in Aulus's biased opinion, the most beautiful sight in Rome. There was a purity to them that defied the grime of the siege. Their feathers were a blinding, snowy white, meticulously groomed. Each feather lay perfectly against the next, creating a surface that looked as smooth as porcelain but felt as soft as a cloud. Aulus sat on his stool inside the enclosure, watching them. The geese were currently engaged in the serious business of preening. It was a communal activity, yet deeply personal. Clementia, the gentle female with the dark eyes, was working on her wing feathers. She would extend her long, graceful neck, turning her head back to nibble and smooth the flight feathers, running her beak along the quill to zip the barbs together. It made a soft, rasping sound. Zip, zip, zip. Magnus, the patriarch, stood in the center of the pen on one leg, the other tucked completely out of sight into his belly feathers. He looked like a statue of a bird, perfectly balanced, his eyes half closed. Every now and then, he would open one eye to check on Aulus, verify that the universe was still in order, and then drift back into his semi-slumber. Aulus reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of dried figs he had saved from his own ration. He broke off a small piece. "For the brave defenders," he whispered. He held the piece out. Clementia was there in an instant, moving with that deceptive speed geese possess, a rolling, waddling run that covered ground surprisingly fast. She took the fig from his fingers with a delicacy that always amazed him. Her beak was hard, serrated like a saw blade, yet her touch was as light as a moth's wing. She swallowed the treat with a happy little chortle, a sound that bubbled up from her chest. Aulus felt a profound sense of gratitude for these creatures. In a city of stone and iron, they were soft and warm. In a time of war, they knew only peace. They were living totems of the natural world, unconcerned with the ambitions of Gauls or Romans. As long as the sun warmed the stones and the grain appeared in the bowl, their world was perfect. The afternoon sun climbed higher, bathing the courtyard in a warm, golden wash. The heat radiated off the temple walls, creating a cozy, sheltered microclimate. It was the quiet hour, the time when even the soldiers at the walls stopped their pacing to rest in the shade. Aulus leaned back against the wooden fence of the coop. The rhythmic sounds of the birds, the soft shuffling of webbed feet, the occasional rustle of wings, the low conversational murmurs they exchanged, acted like a heavy blanket on his mind. He watched a small beetle crawl across the paving stones. It was an iridescent green, shining like an emerald. Flavia, the curious young goose, spotted it too. She lowered her neck, her head turning sideways to get a better look. She followed the beetle for a moment, considering it, before deciding it wasn't worth the effort and settling back down. The beetle continued its journey, safe and ignored. Everything here slowed down. The shadows of the columns lengthened inch by inch, creeping across the courtyard like the hands of a giant sundial. Aulus found himself drifting. His eyelids felt heavy, weighed down by the tranquility of the sanctuary. He thought about the history of this place. Before the temple, before the walls, this hill had been a forest. There had been wolves and eagles here. The wildness was gone, trapped under the paving stones. But sometimes, in the heat of the afternoon, he thought he could smell the old earth, the scent of damp fern and oak moss. "We are just keepers of the rock," he mumbled to himself, his chin dropping to his chest. He dozed. It wasn't a deep sleep, but a floating state between waking and dreaming. He was aware of the warmth of the sun on his legs. He was aware of the soft weight of Magnus leaning against his ankle. The gander had decided that Aulus's sandal was an acceptable pillow. He could feel the bird's body heat radiating through the leather, a steady, living warmth. In this half-dream, the sounds of the siege, the distant shouts, the creak of wagons, were transformed. They became the sound of the wind in the trees, or the rushing of the Tiber. The danger was transmuted into something natural, something that could be endured. He woke with a start as the temperature dropped slightly. The sun had dipped below the temple roof, casting the courtyard into a cool blue shadow. Aulus stretched, his back popping in 3 places. Magnus stood up and shook himself, a full-body ruffle that started at his tail and ended with a shake of his head, his long ears, if he had them, flapping. "Right you are, old friend," Aulus said, standing up and brushing straw from his tunic. "Evening comes." He went to the cistern to draw fresh water for the night. The water in the depths of the hill was always freezing cold, untouched by the heat of the day. He pulled the bucket up, the rope groaning against the stone lip of the well. He poured it into the trough, the sound sharp and clear in the evening hush. The geese gathered for their final drink of the day. They dipped their beaks, then tilted their heads back to let the water run down their long throats, blinking with satisfaction. It was a ritual as old as the temple itself. Aulus ushered them into the coop for the night. They went willingly, seeking the warmth of the straw and each other. He counted them as they waddled in. 1, 2, 3, 12. All present, all safe. He closed the gate and slid the wooden bolt home. The thud of the wood was the final note of the day's song. He stood for a moment in the gathering dusk, looking at the temple. The white marble seemed to glow with an inner light, absorbing the last of the day to hold against the coming night. It was a beacon of stability. The gods might be silent, but the temple stood, and the geese slept, and Aulus was there to watch over them. He turned and walked toward his room, his shadows stretching long and thin ahead of him. The air smelled of cooling stone and the faint, sweet scent of the hay he had spread for the birds. It was a good smell, a safe smell. As he lay down on his cot, Aulus felt a deep, abiding peace. The sanctuary was a fortress of calm in a chaotic world. And as he closed his eyes, the image of the white feathers and the golden dust motes danced behind his eyelids, lulling him into a deep, velvety sleep. Night on the Capitoline Hill was a different world entirely from the sun-drenched stone of the day. As the last traces of twilight were swallowed by the western horizon, the hill seemed to detach itself from the earth, floating in a vast, starry expanse. The darkness here was not empty. It was a physical weight, heavy and velvet soft, pressing down on the eyelids and hushing the voice. Aulus knew the night better than most. While the younger soldiers slept in shifts, snatching fitful dreams of home and warm beds, Aulus found that his old bones preferred the quiet hours. Sleep, when it came to him, was light and easily scattered, like a flock of sparrows. So, he had appointed himself the unofficial guardian of the dark. He wrapped his heaviest woolen cloak around himself, pulling the hood up to shield his ears from the biting wind that always seemed to find the cracks in the masonry. He carried a small lantern, the flame shielded behind a thin sheet of horn, casting a warm amber bubble of light that travelled with him. "The moon is bright tonight," a voice murmured from the shadows. It was Lucius, the young sentry, leaning against a pile of cut timber near the cliff edge. He looked tired, his helmet sitting slightly askew, the metal cold against his forehead. Aulus approached slowly, his sandals making a soft crunch-crunch on the gravel. "A hunter's moon, Lucius. Bright enough to count the stones on the path, but not bright enough to warm the air." Lucius shivered, wrapping his own cloak tighter. "I hate the night watch, Aulus. It's too quiet. My mind starts to play tricks on me. I see shapes down there in the dark. Monsters. Giants." Aulus rested his hand on the low stone wall, looking down into the abyss of the valley. The fires of the Gauls had burned down to low, sullen embers, glowing like the eyes of sleeping beasts. "The dark is just a canvas, lad. Your mind paints what it fears. But look closer. It's just smoke and shadow." They stood together in silence for a long time. The camaraderie of the night watch was a bond forged in few words. It was the shared knowledge that they were the only ones awake in a sleeping world. It was the sound of breathing, the stamp of a cold foot, the shared gaze into the void. After a while, Aulus patted the soldier on the shoulder. "Keep your eyes open, but don't let them deceive you. I'm going to check on the birds." "Good night, Aulus," Lucius whispered, turning back to his vigil. Aulus moved away from the cliff, back toward the sheltered courtyard of the Temple of Juno. The wind was less severe here, blocked by the high walls. The sanctuary was a pool of deep shadow, broken only by the starlight reflecting off the white marble columns. He approached the goose enclosure with the stealth of a thief. He didn't want to wake them, but he needed to know they were safe. He lifted his lantern slightly, letting the dim light spill over the fence. The geese were a study in communal sleeping. They were huddled together in a tight mass of white feathers, a single organism breathing in unison. But Aulus knew the secret of the flock. They were never all asleep at once. Nature had gifted the goose with a remarkable ability. While the center of the flock slept deeply, the birds on the perimeter kept one eye open, literally. Aulus could see it now. Flavia was on the edge, her head tucked under her wing, but one dark beaded eye was wide open, reflecting the tiny flame of his lantern. She was in a state of unihemispheric sleep, half her brain resting while the other half remained alert, watching for foxes, for weasels, for anything that didn't belong. Aulus smiled in the dark. "Good girl," he mouthed. Flavia blinked slowly, acknowledging him, but she did not raise the alarm. She knew him. He was part of the flock. Aulus sat down on the stone steps of the temple porch, extinguishing his lantern to save the oil. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, the world turning into shades of silver and grey. This was his favorite time to think, or rather, to stop thinking. He listened to the wind singing through the eaves of the temple. It was a low, mournful note, like a bow drawn across a cello string. Hoo, hoo. It was a lonely sound, but peaceful. It spoke of age and endurance. This wind had blown over this hill before there was a Rome, and it would blow long after. His thoughts drifted to the cliff face that Lucius was guarding. It was known as the Rock of Carmentis. It was a sheer drop, a vertical wall of tuff and limestone that plunged down to the river valley. No one guarded it heavily because everyone knew it was unclimbable. It was a fortress wall built by the gods themselves. Unclimbable, Aulus whispered to himself, testing the word. He remembered being a boy, scrambling up the ravines of the Capitoline Hill looking for birds' nests. He remembered how a small shrub growing out of a crack could hold the weight of a boy. He remembered how the shadows could hide a handhold. A vague unease prickled at the back of his neck, not a sharp fear, but a dull, nagging instinct. He looked at the sleeping geese again. They were the true guardians. A dog could be bribed with meat. A man could be bribed with gold or overcome by sleep. But a goose? A goose had no concept of bribery. It knew only the flock and the intruder. Magnus shifted in his sleep, letting out a soft, whistling sigh. The sound was incredibly comforting. It was the sound of a creature that felt safe. Aulus leaned his head back against the column behind him. The stone was cool and hard, grounding him. He felt the tension in his shoulders begin to unspool. The night was long, but it was gentle. He closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm of the hill. He could hear the faint clink of a spear butt hitting the ground as a sentry shifted his weight. He could hear the rustle of dry leaves skittering across the courtyard. In the darkness, his other senses sharpened. He could smell the rain that was coming tomorrow, a metallic ozone scent on the breeze. He could smell the wood smoke on his own clothes. He drifted into a light doze, the kind where you are still aware of where you are, but the edges of the world are soft and fuzzy. He dreamed of the temple as a great white ship sailing through the night sky, steered by the goddess, with the geese as the white sails catching the wind. He woke an hour later, stiff but refreshed. The moon had moved across the sky, sinking lower toward the west. The shadows had shifted, elongating and stretching across the courtyard like reaching fingers. Aulus stood up, rubbing his knee. He decided to do one more lap before returning to his bed. He walked past the enclosure again. This time, it was Magnus who was on the perimeter, his one eye gleaming in the moonlight. The changing of the guard had happened silently, instinctively. "You take the watch, then," Aulus whispered. He walked to the edge of the cliff near the temple, away from where Lucius was standing. He looked down into the darkness. It was a precipice of absolute black. Below, the Gauls were sleeping, or perhaps feasting. It didn't matter. Between them and the temple was 100 feet of vertical rock. And yet, Aulus stayed there for a long moment, listening. He listened not for the shouting of an army, but for the small sounds. The snap of a twig, the scuff of a boot on stone, the heavy breathing of exertion. He heard nothing, only the wind, only the river. "Safe," he breathed out, the word turning into a white puff of mist in the cold air. The silence was profound. It was a blanket that covered the hill, tucking it in. The soldiers were safe. The temple was safe. The city was waiting. Aulus turned back toward his room. The cold had seeped into his bones, making the prospect of his straw mattress and wool blanket incredibly inviting. He opened his door, the hinges groaning softly, a familiar domestic sound. He didn't know that below him, in the deepest shadows of the cliff, where the moonlight didn't reach, something was moving. It was slow, agonizingly slow. It was the silence of a predator stalking its prey. But for now, on the summit, there was only peace. Aulus lay down, pulling the covers up to his chin. He let the sound of the wind become a lullaby. He visualized the geese, their white heads tucked under their wings, their hearts beating slow and steady. He joined them in the dark, his breathing slowing to match the rhythm of the night. The watcher on the wall had finished his rounds. The hill was under the protection of the birds now, and Aulus slept, deep and dreamless, wrapped in the illusion of safety that the night provides. While the citadel slept under the watchful protection of the high stars and the slumbering geese, the world at the foot of the hill was awake with a different kind of energy. Down in the valley, where the shadows pooled thick and heavy like spilled ink, the silence was not the silence of rest. It was the silence of a held breath, the quiet concentration of a predator waiting for the wind to shift. The camp of the Gauls sprawled through the ruins of the lower city. By day, it was a chaotic hive of noise, feasting and looting. But by night, under the cool gaze of the moon, it transformed into a landscape of murmurs and embers. The fires that had roasted oxen earlier in the evening had burned down to glowing beds of coals, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic red light that mimicked the heartbeat of a sleeping beast. Near the base of the Capitoline Hill, specifically near the sheer cliff known as the Rock of Carmentis, a small group of warriors stood in the darkness. They were not ordinary foot soldiers. These were the scouts, the climbers, men who had grown up in the jagged peaks of the Alps. They moved with a fluidity that belied their size, their leather-soled boots making no sound on the cobblestones. They were looking at the rock face. To the untrained eye, like the eyes of the Roman sentries dozing 300 feet above, the cliff was a smooth, impenetrable wall of tuff and limestone, slick with the damp of the river and choked with thorny vines. It was a fortress wall built by geology itself, dismissing any notion of ascent. But the leader of the Gallic scouts, a man with eyes the color of pale ice, saw something different. He held a torch low to the ground, shielding the flame with his cloak so that not a flicker of light would escape upwards. He ran his hand over the rough stone at the base of the cliff. There, in the patch of damp moss that carpeted the rock, was a mark. It was a small thing, easily missed. A patch of green moss had been scraped away, revealing the raw grey stone beneath. A few feet higher, a tuft of grass growing from a crevice had been crushed, the blades bent downwards, and higher still, a scratch on the limestone, white and fresh against the weathered surface. Someone had climbed this rock. The scout traced the path with his eyes. It was a trail of desperation and courage. A Roman messenger, perhaps, slipping through the enemy lines to take orders to the Senate on the hill. The scout smiled in the dark. It was a cold, appreciative smile. If a Roman could climb up, a Gaul could certainly follow. He signaled to his companions. There were no words spoken. The language of the night raid was one of gestures and glances. They studied the cliff face as a scholar studies a scroll. They mapped the handholds, the ledges, the sturdy roots of the caper bushes that clung to the vertical surface. They were memorizing the route, turning the chaotic geology into a ladder in their minds. The air in the valley was heavy with humidity. The Tiber River, swollen with the autumn rains, murmured sluggishly against its banks. The sound of the water was a constant, low-frequency hum that masked the small sounds of preparation. The tightening of a belt, the soft shing of a dagger being checked in its sheath, the stretching of cold muscles. Far above, on the ramparts of the citadel, the Roman sentries were fighting their own battle against the heavy, narcotic pull of the night. The rhythmic pacing, the endless staring into the black void, the soothing sound of the wind, it all conspired to weigh down the eyelids. They assumed the cliff was safe. They assumed the enemy was asleep. They assumed that gravity was their unshakable ally. But gravity is a law that can be bent by those with enough will. Back in the Temple of Juno, the atmosphere was thick with the peace of the deep night. Aulus turned in his sleep, pulling his wool blanket tighter around his shoulders. He was dreaming of the harvest, of golden fields of wheat swaying in the summer breeze. In his dream, the wind was whispering to him, a soft, rustling sound that seemed to say, "Wake up, wake up." But the dream was too comfortable, the blanket too warm. He sighed and settled deeper into the straw mattress. Outside in the courtyard, the geese were still. The cluster of white bodies remained motionless, a pale island in the dark. However, the air currents around the hill were changing. As the Gauls below began to move toward the rock face, displacing the air, disturbing the stillness, faint ripples traveled up the cliff. It wasn't a sound exactly. It was a vibration, a disturbance in the force of the night. Magnus, sleeping with his head tucked under his wing, shifted his weight. His webbed foot adjusted its grip on the cold stone. The vibrations coming up through the rock were minute, the scrape of a fingernail against stone, the soft compression of soil. But to a creature evolved to feel the footsteps of a fox on soft earth, they were there. Down in the valley, the ascent began. It was a slow, agonizingly patient process. The first Gaul reached up, his fingers finding a narrow fissure in the rock. He tested it, pulling down with his full weight. The stone held. He pulled himself up, his muscles coiling like ropes under his skin. He found a toehold, then another handhold. He moved like a spider, silent and deliberate. He was followed by another, and then another. They formed a human chain, a silent serpent winding its way up the vertical face of the Capitoline. They did not carry heavy shields or rattling armor. They carried only their swords and their immense strength. The climb was a meditation in focus. One slip meant death, a silent plummet into the darkness below. But they did not slip. They were part of the rock now. They merged with the shadows, finding purchase where there seemed to be none. They passed the crushed grass the messenger had left. They passed the scraped moss. They were ghosts ascending a staircase of air. Halfway up, the leader paused on a narrow ledge to catch his breath. He pressed his cheek against the cold stone, closing his eyes for a moment to center himself. He could smell the scents of the summit drifting down to him, the smell of pine, of burning oil from a dying torch, and the faint, distinct, musky scent of birds. He looked up. The parapet was a jagged black line against the starry sky. It looked impossibly high, yet tantalizingly close. There were no heads peering over the edge, no spear points glinting in the starlight. The Romans were confident in their isolation. The climber signaled the advance to continue. The sounds of the climb were swallowed by the vastness of the night. The scuff of a boot was lost in the rustle of the wind. The heavy breathing of the men was masked by the distant murmur of the river. To anyone listening from above, the night sounded exactly as it had for the last 100 nights, empty and peaceful. But the emptiness was filling up. The danger was rising like water in a lock, inch by inch, silent and inevitable. In the goose enclosure, Flavia opened her eye, the one that was awake. She stared into the darkness of the courtyard. She didn't see anything. The shadows of the columns were still. The gate was locked. But her long neck extended slightly, the feathers on her head smoothing down. She listened. She heard the wind. She heard the drip of the water trough. And then she heard something else. A tiny pebble dislodged from the cliff face by a climbing hand, clattering down the rock. Click, click, click. It was a tiny sound, quieter than a falling leaf, but it didn't belong. Flavia let out a low, questioning warble. It wasn't an alarm, not yet. It was a query. Who is there? The sound woke Magnus. He pulled his head out from his wing, blinking in the gloom. He looked at Flavia, then he looked at the wall that separated the temple grounds from the cliff edge. He stood perfectly still, his body tense, waiting for a confirmation. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. The pebble had stopped falling. The climbers had frozen, sensing the movement of the birds above. For a long, stretched minute, man and bird waited in the dark. The Gauls clung to the side of the cliff, their hearts hammering against their ribs, praying to their gods that the wind would cover them. The geese stood in their pen, their black eyes scanning the shadows, waiting for the anomaly to repeat itself. Then, the wind picked up again, rustling the oak trees, masking the world in a wash of white noise. The climbers exhaled and resumed their ascent. The geese, soothed by the return of familiar sounds, relaxed slightly. Flavia lowered her head, though she did not tuck it back in. The shadow was almost at the top. The impossible climb was nearly complete. The line of warriors was a dark vein pulsing up the side of the hill, unseen, unheard, and deadly. And Aulus, the keeper, slept on, wrapped in his blanket, dreaming of golden wheat and the soft, safe embrace of summer, while winter climbed toward him out of the dark. The ascent up the rock of Carmentis was not a dash, nor a scramble. It was a slow, hypnotic growth. Like ivy claiming the side of an abandoned villa, the line of Gallic warriors inched their way up the vertical face of the Capitoline Hill. In the profound silence of the night, the movement was almost geological, as if the earth itself were shifting, pushing these men upward through the strata of darkness toward the sleeping sky. The lead climber, a warrior whose name has been lost to the mist of history, moved with a terrifying patience. He did not look down. To look down was to see the abyss, the swallowing dark of the valley floor where the river wound like a black snake. He looked only at the stone inches from his face. He studied the texture of the tuff, the volcanic rock that formed the bones of Rome. It was rough, pitted with small craters and fissures, offering just enough friction for a fingertip, just enough of a ledge for the side of a boot. He reached up. His hand, calloused and strong, ghosted over the surface, seeking the next hold. He found a thick root of a caper bush growing stubbornly from a crack. He tested it, pulling gently at first, then committing his weight. The root held. He pulled himself up, his muscles contracting in a smooth, silent rhythm. Reach, test, pull. Reach, test, pull. Below him, The next man placed his hand exactly where the leader's foot had been. It was a chain of perfect imitation. They breathed in unison, a shallow, controlled intake of the cold night air, exhaling slowly to prevent the white plumes of their breath from drifting too far. 300 feet is a long way to climb in the dark. It is a journey that distorts time. To the climbers, minutes stretched into hours. The world narrowed down to the next 3 feet of rock. The sounds of the night, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of dry grass became magnified, significant. At the top of the cliff, the citadel remained wrapped in a blanket of complacency. The Roman sentries, posted at the more accessible approaches, had long since succumbed to the heavy, lidded rhythm of the dog watch. The air was cold, the cloaks were warm, and the silence was persuasive. Even the dogs, those reliable guardians of the night, had curled into balls of fur, noses tucked into tails, dreaming of bones and warmth. They smelled nothing but the damp earth and the dying fires of the city below. But the dogs relied on scent, and the wind was blowing from the north, carrying the scent of the climbers away from the walls. The Gauls were invisible to the nose, invisible to the eye, and silent to the ear. Yet there were other ears on the hill. Inside the sacred enclosure of Juno, the atmosphere was shifting. Geese are creatures of the ground. Their world is defined by the vibrations that travel through the earth. They can feel the worm moving in the soil. They can feel the fox pacing 100 yards away. Magnus was awake. He was standing on one leg in the center of the coop, his long neck extended like a periscope. He had not made a sound yet. To make a sound without a confirmed threat was against the code of the flock. It wasted energy. It caused unnecessary panic. But he felt it. Thump, thump, thump. It was not a sound he heard with his ears, but a tremor he felt in the webbing of his foot. It was a rhythmic disturbance in the bedrock of the hill. Something heavy was connecting with the stone, again and again, getting closer. Beside him, Clementia shifted in the straw. She too had sensed the change. The flock, usually a pile of soft, oblivious down at this hour, began to stir. Heads popped out from under wings. Black eyes blinked open, catching the faint starlight. There was a collective rustle, the sound of stiff feathers brushing against each other. Shh, shh, shh. Aulus, in his small room attached to the temple, was deep in the grip of slumber. The cold air of the room was tempered by the warmth of his wool blankets. He was breathing deeply, a slow, rasping snore that rattled comfortably in his chest. In his dream, he was walking along the banks of the Tiber, but the river was rising. The water was silent, creeping up the banks, covering the grass, covering his sandals. It wasn't frightening, just inevitable. The water was rising, and he couldn't stop it. Outside, the lead climber's hand reached the final obstacle, the parapet itself. The wall here was low, a simple construction of dry stone meant to define the sacred boundary rather than repel an army. The Romans had believed the cliff was the wall. The climber's fingers curled over the edge of the stonework. The stone was cold and damp with dew. He paused. This was the moment of greatest danger. If he pulled himself up and a sentry was standing there, it would be over. He waited, listening. He heard the wind whistling softly through the gaps in the stones. He heard the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a sleeping man somewhere to his left. He heard the flutter of wings from the temple courtyard. He pulled. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, a silhouette detached itself from the darkness of the cliff and rose into the starry sky. First, the head, covered in a leather cap, then the broad shoulders, then the torso. The Gaul rolled over the parapet, his movement fluid and silent, like oil pouring over a lip. He crouched low instantly, merging with the shadows of the rampart. He held his breath, scanning the courtyard. He saw the sleeping forms of the Roman guards wrapped in their cloaks, looking like grey boulders in the dim light. He saw the white columns of the Temple of Juno glowing softly, and he saw the wooden enclosure of the geese. He signalled to the edge. A second silhouette appeared, then a third. They gathered in the shadows, a growing pool of darkness within the sanctuary. They were inside. The impossible had been achieved. The citadel of Rome, the last hope of the Republic, had been breached without a sword being drawn, without a shout being raised. The leader pointed toward the sleeping guards. The plan was simple. Silence the sentries before they could wake, open the gates from the inside, and let the rest of the army in. It was to be a massacre in the dark, a swift and silent end to the siege. They began to creep forward. They moved on the balls of their feet, their balance perfect. They were hunters, and the Romans were the sleeping deer. But they had forgotten the variable that no military strategist accounts for. They had forgotten the birds. Magnus was watching. From his vantage point in the enclosure, he saw the shadows detach from the wall. He saw them moving against the natural order of the night. Shadows were supposed to be still, or to move with the moon. These shadows moved with intent. They moved toward the flock. The vibration in the ground changed. It was no longer the deep thump of the climb. It was the soft, stealthy pad of stalking feet. The tension in the coop became electric. Every goose was awake now. 12 pairs of eyes were fixed on the approaching shapes. 12 long necks were stretched out, rigid and alert. The air in the enclosure seemed to hum with suppressed energy. The Gauls were close now. They were passing the temple, moving toward the sleeping guards near the gate. One of the warriors, perhaps distracted by the strange white shapes in the pen, or perhaps just careless in his victory, stepped a fraction of an inch too close to the enclosure. His scabbard scraped against the wooden fence. Scritch. It was a tiny sound. In the roar of a battle, it would have been nothing. In the bustling market of the day, it would have been lost. But in the perfect, glass-like silence of the high citadel night, it was a thunderclap. It was the trigger. Magnus did not hesitate. The ancient pact between the bird and the goddess, the instinct of the territorial sentinel, the sheer indignation of the disturbed sleeper, it all coalesced into a single moment of action. He lowered his head, hissed a warning that sounded like steam escaping a vent, and then, with a power that belied his size, he launched himself at the wooden slats of the fence. He flapped his massive wings, the sound detonating in the quiet courtyard like a cracking whip. Whap, 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 whap. The silence of the night was not just broken. It was shattered into 1,000 pieces. The heavy, suffocating quiet that had allowed the Gauls to climb, that had lulled the Romans to sleep, was gone. And deep in his room, Aulus stopped dreaming of the rising river. His eyes snapped open. The sound was not the gentle murmuring of the water. It was the sound of his children. It was the sound of the flock in distress. He sat up in the darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs. The air was no longer still. It was vibrating with the chaotic, frantic energy of the awakening. The vine had climbed the wall. The shadows were in the garden, but the garden was waking up. The sound that shattered the silence of the Capitoline Hill was not the noble trumpet of war, nor the deep, resonant drum of a marching legion. It was a sound far more chaotic, more primal, and, in its own way, more terrifying to the unexpecting ear. It was the collective, indignant, ear-splitting scream of 12 sacred geese who had been rudely awakened from a very sound sleep. If you have never heard the alarm call of a goose, it is difficult to describe the sheer volume it occupies. It is a harsh, brassy honk that layers over itself, echoing and amplifying until it fills every corner of the air. But this was not just one goose. This was the entire flock of Juno, led by the furious Magnus, erupting into a cacophony of hisses, shrieks, and the thunderous clapping of powerful wings against wood and stone. Inside his small room, Aulus was jolted from his bed as if pulled by an invisible wire. The transition from the deep, velvet darkness of sleep to the adrenaline-fueled reality of the moment was instantaneous. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't think of his own safety. He didn't think of the Gauls or the gold or the glory of Rome. "The foxes," he gasped, scrambling for his sandals in the dark and missing them entirely. "The foxes are at the coop." He grabbed the nearest weapon at hand, his sturdy birch broom, and threw open his door. The scene that met his eyes in the courtyard was a tableau of moonlight and madness. The peaceful sanctuary had transformed into a swirling vortex of white feathers and dark shadows. The lantern he had left near the temple entrance had been knocked over, extinguishing the flame, so the only light came from the cold, indifferent moon hanging high above. But the moon was enough to reveal the truth. These were not foxes. Standing near the enclosure, silhouetted against the pale marble of the temple columns, were the massive shapes of men. They were frozen for a split second, stunned by the acoustic explosion that had erupted from the pen. The element of surprise, which had been their ladder and their shield, had evaporated instantly. "Intruders!" Aulus yelled, his voice cracking with age and fear, but carrying across the courtyard. "To the walls! To the walls!" He raised his broom and ran forward. It was a ridiculous sight. An old man in a wool tunic charging a squad of hardened warriors with a cleaning implement. But Aulus was possessed by a protective fury that knew no logic. However, the true defense had already begun. Magnus the gander had managed to fly over the low wooden fence of the enclosure. He was a projectile of white fury. With his neck extended and his beak snapping, he launched himself at the nearest shadow, the lead climber who had just signaled the others. The Gaul, a seasoned warrior who had fought bears in the forests of the north and survived the phalanxes of the Etruscans, was completely unprepared for this. He raised his sword instinctively, but you cannot parry a goose. Magnus slammed into the warrior's chest, his wings beating with the force of a heavy canvas sail in a storm. Whap! 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 The Gaul stumbled backward, his boots slipping on the dew-slicked stones. He flailed, trying to protect his face from the pinching beak that was seeking his eyes. "Get back!" the warrior shouted in his own tongue, confused and off balance. At that moment, the door to the commander's quarters burst open. Marcus Manlius did not stumble. He did not hesitate. He emerged into the night like a statue brought to life by the urgency of the alarm. He was not wearing his breastplate, there had been no time, but he carried his heavy oval shield and its short sword, the gladius. His face was a mask of cold, waking rage. He took in the scene in a single heartbeat. The panicked geese, the shouting old man, the dark shapes of the enemy swarming over the parapet. "Rome! To me!" Manlius roared, his voice booming like thunder, shaking the very stones of the citadel. He charged. He ignored the Gauls who were still climbing over the wall and went straight for the leader, who was still entangled with the furious Magnus. The Gauls saw Manlius coming, a wall of muscle and bronze moving with the speed of a striking snake. He tried to shove the goose away and raise his shield, but he was too slow. Manlius did not use his sword. He used the boss of his shield, the heavy bronze hemisphere in the center. He struck the Gaul in the chest with the force of a battering ram. The impact made a sickening, wet thud. The Gaul, already off balance from the bird's assault, was lifted off his feet. He flew backward over the edge of the parapet into the empty air from which he had just climbed. There was no scream, just the rush of wind, and then, seconds later, a distant crash in the valley below. But there were more of them. 2 other climbers had made it onto the solid ground of the courtyard. They lunged at Manlius, their long swords flashing in the moonlight. Manlius parried the first blow with his shield, sparks flying as iron met bronze. He spun, using the momentum to slash at the second attacker's legs. The courtyard was filled with the sounds of metal on metal, the grunts of exertion, and the ceaseless, deafening honking of the geese. Aulus, meanwhile, had reached the coop. He wasn't a soldier, but he knew how to create confusion. He unlatched the gate. "Out! Out, my beauties!" he cried. The rest of the flock spilled out into the courtyard like a flood of white water. They were confused, angry, and terrified. They ran everywhere, weaving between the legs of the combatants, hissing and flapping. To the Gauls, it was a nightmare. The ground was moving. White shapes were snapping at their ankles. The noise was disorienting, drowning out their orders, making it impossible to coordinate. One climber, trying to step over a hissing Flavia, tripped and fell hard on the paving stones. Before he could rise, Manlius was upon him, the pommel of his sword descending in a sharp final arc. By now, the rest of the Roman garrison was waking up. Confusion turned to realization. Soldiers poured out of the barracks, half-dressed, clutching spears and shields. "The wall! Defend the wall!" Manlius shouted, pointing his bloodied sword toward the cliff edge. The Romans rushed the parapet. They looked over the edge and saw the line of climbers still clinging to the rock face, frozen in indecision. The element of surprise was gone. The leader was gone. Above them, a wall of Roman steel and angry birds was waiting. The climbers did the only thing they could. They let go, sliding and scrambling desperately back down the rock face, dropping into the darkness, fleeing the chaos of the summit. The Romans began to hurl rocks and javelins down into the shadows, but there was little need. The retreat was total. The unclimbable rock had been climbed, but the citadel had held. Manlius stood by the edge of the cliff, his chest heaving. His skin glistened with sweat in the moonlight. He lowered his shield, the adrenaline slowly beginning to ebb away, replaced by the heavy, trembling fatigue of the aftermath. The noise in the courtyard began to subside. The soldiers lowered their weapons, looking at each other with wide, bewildered eyes. They looked at the dead Gauls on the stones. They looked at the dark cliff edge. And then they looked at the geese. The birds, sensing that the immediate danger had passed, began to group together again. They were agitated, their feathers ruffled, still letting out the occasional indignant honk, but the panic was fading. Aulus was on his knees in the center of the yard, his broom forgotten on the ground. He was trembling, his old hands shaking uncontrollably. He wasn't hurt, but the shock was a heavy weight on his chest. Magnus, the warrior bird, waddled over to him. The gander had lost a few feathers in the scuffle, and he looked thoroughly annoyed, but he was unharmed. He nudged Aulus's arm with his beak, a soft, familiar pressure. "You foolish, brave bird," Aulus whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out and wrapped his arms around the gander's neck, burying his face in the soft, warm down. "You saved us. You saved us all." Manlius walked over, his heavy sandals crunching on the gravel. The other soldiers made way for him, a respectful silence falling over the group. The commander looked down at the old man and the bird. He looked at the white feathers scattered like snow across the battlefield. He sheathed his sword with a sharp click. "I have guards who sleep," Manlius said, his voice rough but quiet. "I have dogs that snore, but it seems the goddess keeps her own watch." He knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with Aulus. He reached out and placed a heavy hand on Aulus's shoulder. "The city owes you a debt, keeper," Manlius said, "and it owes a debt to this noisy, ill-tempered flock." Aulus looked up, tears streaking the dust on his face. "They were just hungry, Commander, or maybe they just didn't like the smell of them." A ripple of laughter went through the gathered soldiers, a nervous, relieved sound that broke the tension. The terror of the night was dissolving into the absurdity of the situation. They had been saved not by the might of legions, but by the cackling of geese. The soldiers began to disperse, checking the perimeter, doubling the guard, dragging the bodies of the intruders away. But the atmosphere had changed. The suffocating dread of the siege was broken. They had faced the enemy in their own sanctuary, and won. Aulus stood up, his knees groaning in protest. He dusted off his tunic. "Come on then," he said to the flock, his voice returning to its gentle, rhythmic cadence. "Back to bed. The show is over." He herded the birds back toward the enclosure. They went willingly, perhaps realizing that the warm straw was preferable to the cold stone. Magnus was the last to go in. He stopped at the gate, turned his head, and let out one final defiant honk at the cliff edge, a warning to the darkness that he was still watching. Aulus latched the gate. He checked it twice. Click, click. The sound was the same as every other night, but tonight it meant something different. It was the sound of safety restored. The moon continued its slow arc across the sky, indifferent to the violence that had just occurred. The wind picked up again, scrubbing the air clean, carrying away the scent of fear. Aulus didn't go back to his room immediately. He sat on his stool by the coop, listening to the birds settle down. He listened to the soft rustle of their feathers as they preened, calming themselves. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. But it was a good exhaustion. It was the feeling of having held the line. He leaned his head back against the wooden fence. The danger had passed. The Gauls had been thrown from the rock. Rome was safe for another night. And as the first hint of grey began to touch the eastern sky, promising the arrival of dawn, Aulus closed his eyes, lulled by the steady, victorious breathing of his flock. The dawn that followed the night of the geese was one of the most beautiful Rome had ever seen. It did not break with a sudden burst of glory, but rather arrived with a slow, tender grace, as if the sun itself were tiptoeing over the Apennines so as not to disturb the weary city. The sky turned from the deep, bruised charcoal of the night to a soft, translucent pearl, and then, gradually, to a pale, washing blue. Aulus sat on the steps of the Temple of Juno, watching the light return to the world. He had not gone back to sleep. He had stayed with his flock, listening to their breathing, watching the feathers on their backs rise and fall in the calming rhythm of rest. The adrenaline of the night had drained away, leaving him with a feeling of lightness, a strange, hollow clarity that often follows a great storm. The air was crisp and smelled of rain that had fallen in the distant hills. Below, the mist still clung to the winding curves of the Tiber, a ribbon of white cotton hiding the scars of the siege. But up here, on the summit, the golden light of the morning sun caught the bronze roof of the temple, making it glow like a beacon. The soldiers were awake, but they moved with a new softness. The usual clatter of armor and the rough banter of the barracks were absent. They walked with the hushed reverence of men who had stared into the abyss and been pulled back by a miracle. As they passed the goose enclosure, they stopped. They didn't just glance. They stopped and looked. Young Lucius, the sentry who had feared the dark, approached the pen. He held his ration of hard bread in his hand, a precious commodity in a besieged citadel. He broke it into small, manageable chunks. "Here," he whispered, tossing the bread gently over the fence. "Eat well, little warriors." Magnus, never one to turn down a meal regardless of the source or the sentiment, waddled over and snapped up the bread. He looked at Lucius with his beady black eyes, gave a short, satisfied honk, and waited for more. Aulus smiled. It was a tired, crinkled smile that reached his eyes. "Be careful, lad," he said softly. "You'll spoil them. They are sacred, but they are also gluttons." Lucius looked at the old man. "They earned it, Aulus. They earned every crumb in Rome." As the morning progressed, this became a ritual. One by one, the defenders of the capital came to pay their respects. A centurion brought a handful of dried berries. A spearman brought a bowl of fresh water. Even Marcus Manlius, the hero of the fight, came to the enclosure. He stood silently for a long time, watching the white birds move against the grey stone. He didn't offer food. He offered his presence, a silent salute from one warrior to another. The siege did not end that morning. The Gauls remained in the valley for months, and the hardship continued. There were negotiations, there were scales weighed with gold, and there was the eventual thunderous arrival of the exiled dictator Camillus to finally drive the enemy away. But the fear, the paralyzing, suffocating dread that the hill would fall in the night, was gone. The Romans knew that the rock was watched. They knew that the goddess was awake. For Aulus, life returned to its slow, measured cadence, though the world around him had changed. He was no longer just the old man with the broom. He was the keeper. He was the man who had listened when the world was sleeping. Yet he sought no office, no reward. His reward was the sunrise. His reward was the sound of the water splashing into the trough and the feel of the warm sun on the temple wall. Seasons turned. The winter rains washed the blood from the stones. The spring brought wildflowers that bloomed in the cracks of the cliff face, tiny splashes of yellow and purple where the Gauls had tried to climb. The city below began to rebuild. The sounds of hammers and saws drifted up to the hill, a symphony of reconstruction. The smell of smoke was replaced by the smell of fresh timber and wet mortar. The story of the geese began to weave itself into the fabric of the city. It was told in the marketplaces and the taverns. Mothers told it to their children to help them sleep. Close your eyes, my love. The geese are watching. Nothing can creep up on us now. Years passed, flowing like the water of the Tiber. Aulus grew older. His hair turned completely white, matching the feathers of his charges. His knee clicked more often, and his walks around the perimeter became slower, more deliberate. But he never missed a night. The geese, too, lived out their days in luxury. They were no longer just birds, they were icons. The Roman state, in a gesture of eternal gratitude, allocated funds for their care. They were fed the finest grain, the freshest greens. Once a year, a procession was held in their honor. The citizens of Rome would carry a golden litter upon which sat a goose, perhaps a descendant of Magnus or Flavia, adorned in purple and gold. They were paraded through the forum, cheered by the crowds, the saviors of the Capitol. But Aulus preferred the quiet days. He preferred the afternoons when the excitement of the festival was over, and the hill returned to its silence. One warm autumn evening, many years after the siege, Aulus sat on his stool in the enclosure. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The light was the color of honey and amber, thick and warm. Magnus was gone now, passed on to the great flock in the sky, but his lineage remained. A young gander, bold and loud, patrolled the fence. Aulus called him Little Magnus, though he was already larger than his namesake. Aulus leaned back against the warm stone of the temple. He felt a profound sense of completion. He had done his job. He had kept the watch. The city below was teeming with life, a Rome that was growing, conquering, building monuments that would last forever. But here, in the high garden, time stood still. The wind rustled the leaves of the oak trees. Hush, hush, hush! It was the same wind that had blown on the night of the climb. It was the same wind that had cooled the sweat on Manlius's brow. But now it carried only peace. Aulus closed his eyes. He listened to the sounds of the flock settling down for the night, the soft rustle of wings, the gentle murmur of content, the rhythmic click-click of a beak cleaning a feather. It was a lullaby that had lasted a lifetime. He thought about the nature of heroes. They weren't always the men with the biggest swords or the loudest voices. Sometimes, a hero was just a creature doing what it was born to do, protecting its home, calling out in the dark. Sometimes, a hero was just an old man who loved his birds enough to wake up. The sun dipped below the horizon. The sky turned a deep, velvety purple. The first stars appeared, diamond hard and bright. "Rest now," Aulus whispered to the birds. "The wall is high, the rock is strong." "Rest now," the wind seemed to whisper back to him. Aulus felt his breathing slow down. In, out, in, out. The heaviness of the years settled over him like a warm blanket. He felt the tension leave his shoulders, his hands, his legs. He was part of the hill now. He was as permanent as the stones, as constant as the stars. The city of Rome would rise and fall. Emperors would come and go. Marble would turn to dust. But the memory of this peace would remain. The memory of the white feathers in the moonlight, the cackle in the dark, and the dawn that saved a civilization. The image of the sleeping geese filled his mind. White shapes in the darkness, warm, soft, and safe. They were a circle of protection, Nothing could break that circle. And so, Aulus the keeper, the unlikely hero, drifted into sleep. It was a deep, dreamless sleep, the kind that only comes when you know with absolute certainty that the world is safe, that the night is friendly, and that you are exactly where you are meant to be. The story is over. The hill is quiet. The geese are sleeping. Good night.